um, former President Donald Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., met with a man deeply connected in the Middle East. He was there as an emissary of two powerful princes from Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. According to the Times, that emissary from Saudi and UAE told Don Jr. that those two countries, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, were both eager to do whatever they could to help Donald Trump get elected president that November. Also at that meeting with Donald Trump's son was, according to the Times, a, quote, specialist in social media manipulation. The Times reports that his firm had drawn up a multi-million-dollar proposal for a social media manipulation effort that could be used secretly, covertly, to manipulate the electorate to help Donald Trump get elected. It was groundbreaking reporting from the New York Times back in 2018. And of course, we never found out for sure whether or not that social media manipulation plan ever went into effect, whether Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates actually did end up supporting or enacting or funding some sort of covert plan to help manipulate social media in the U.S., to help change voter views and voter behavior, to help Donald Trump become president. A lawyer for Don Jr. denied that he had ever seriously entertained such an idea. The man who was described in the Times as the social media manipulator, he denied it all too. But today we can add an interesting new data point. We learned from today's indictment of the Donald Trump inaugural chairman. We learned that Tom Barrack was allegedly working with the UAE at that time to influence both the Trump campaign and U.S. policy. According to the indictment, Tom Barrack flew to Morocco on August 3rd, 2016, to present this major proposal to his friends in the UAE in terms of a new strategic alignment between that country and the United States. That date ends up being sort of important in retrospect because on that exact same date, that Trump Tower meeting was underway where a representative from the United Arab Emirates was offering to help Donald Trump get elected with a multi-million-dollar covert social media campaign on his behalf. What was going on there between the Trump campaign and his advisors and the United Arab Emirates? Yet another Trump advisor now indicted as a secret foreign agent, Tom Barrack, accused by prosecutors of secretly working essentially on the UAE's payroll to affect U.S. government policy and the behavior of that campaign. But does today's indictment get us any closer to figuring out how we got messed with by other countries, both in terms of secret foreign agents, but also potentially interference in our electoral affairs in 2016 and beyond? Joining us now is David Kirkpatrick. He's a national correspondent for the New York Times. He's one of the reporters bylined on that story about the meeting in Trump Tower, first reported in 2018. Mr. Kirkpatrick, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
First, let me know if I've got any of this wrong. I feel like I've learned all of this stuff as it has come out over the months and years, and then you never know which part of it you're going to have to go back to and learn again and remind yourself who's connected to who and who's been indicted already and who's been pardoned. Let me just ask you, from your understanding, if I screwed any of this up in the way that I told it.
Yeah, I think you got it pretty right. It's pretty confusing. I've got to say, I'm going to add one more confusing part of this. You know, you've outlined a couple of parallel influence operations. One that went through Tom Barrack, Trump's best friend, a businessman who's done business with Trump, and also with these Persian Gulf princes. Then there's another one, which is George Nader, an emissary from the UAE who's subsequently been convicted of pedophilia, who was in there in Trump Tower trying to set up this social media manipulation scheme. You got to add to that another leg of this, which is it turns out that Mohammed bin Zayed, the prince who was working through Barrack and Nader, was also working with Nader to try to play matchmaker between the Trump campaign and the Russians. So MBZ and George Nader were setting up a meeting for Erik Prince to meet with Kirill Dmitriev, an emissary from Putin, in the Seychelles. Also around the time all of this was going on, which is one of the elements that has drawn all these figures into the scope of the Mueller campaign. So if you're putting this under the umbrella of foreign countries trying to influence the Trump administration, you got to look at several different UAE paths and the possibility that there was some sort of overlap between what the Emiratis were doing and what the Russians were up to. And I'm sorry it's that confusing, but I didn't make all this up.
No, it's sort of just confusing enough to give me lots of follow-up questions to ask you. I mean, it has always stuck out for me that we know. I mean, even if you just say, let's only look at the bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee, even if you don't want to look at what Mueller did, the U.S. government has unequivocally and in a bipartisan manner determined that Russia did mount an operation to try to influence the electorate to Trump's benefit in the 2016 election. You and your colleagues reported on a proposal to do something that sounds very much like that was being organized and sort of offered by a guy in a private business context. Presumably, maybe the idea was that the Emiratis and the Saudis would pay the cost of that if the Trump campaign agreed to let it go forward. They just sound so similar. Obviously, they were aiming at the same thing. We know the Russian operation happened. In the years that have passed, have we ever gotten any close to figuring out if the other operation that was offered at that Trump Tower meeting that maybe the Emiratis and the Saudis were going to pay for, have we ever gotten any closer to figuring out if that happened?
I don't have any information indicating that it did. All we know, as you suggested before, is money was still changing hands between George Nader, who's working for Mohammed bin Zayed and the Emirates. Money was still changing hands between him and Joel Zamel, who was the social media expert from Israel, who was involved in this pitch all the way up through the campaign. Joel Zamel was in during the transition, showing some kind of slides or PowerPoint presentation to the Trump team. But what went on, I don't have any reason to believe. I don't have any evidence that anything was actually done on behalf of the Trump campaign by the Saudis, the Emiratis, anything like this. Now, but then you got to look at the bigger picture here. What's happening is Mohammed bin Zayed, the head of the United Arab Emirates, the richest man in the world. He's got 1.3 trillion in sovereign wealth funds. He was unhappy with the Obama administration. He very much wanted influence with the new team coming in. The Trump team coming in takes what the Saudis described as a transactional mindset. So here are people in charge, Trump, Kushner, who have all their lives been real estate developers and sellers in the real estate market. And over on the other side, in the Emirates, you've got the Emiratis and the Saudis who for decades have been some of the biggest buyers for major real estate assets. So hovering over all of this business being done, all this political and public policy business being done between the Trump White House and the Saudis, Emiratis, is also the awareness that when the Trump administration is over, now they're going to go back to their other roles, where Trump and Kushner are real estate developers and the Saudis and the Emiratis are real estate buyers. And that created a kind of sweetness, if you will, around the whole relationship.
David, I know that you have covered Tom Barrack closely and covered his importance to the Trump campaign and his relationship to that world you were just describing. I just have to ask you if you were surprised to see him get indicted today. There's been reporting on him being under investigation, him being questioned, him being sort of scrutinized by prosecutors for a very long time. Did it shock you today when you found out that he'd been arrested?
It sure did. Boy, did it. I got to say, that guy could sell snow to the Eskimos. I mean, if you read the indictment, one of the things that comes through is how unbelievably ingratiating he is to the people he deals with, both in the Trump administration and on the Emirati side. I mean, you use the word suck up, I think. He really, for a guy who is 74 years old and himself a billionaire, he really knows how to be humble and kind of aw shucks. And he has lied and lied and lied. If what this indictment is saying is true, then his lies about his role with the Emirates and the things that he did for them have been just tremendous. And I think it was really hard for me to believe that he could lie like that if he knew that people were out there or messages were out there that could eventually hang him up, as they appear now to have done.
David Kirkpatrick, national correspondent for the New York Times. I was so hoping that I was going to be able to get you here on the show to talk about this tonight. Thanks so much for making time.
Thank you.
All right. As we continue to absorb the sort of implications of the Trump inaugural chairman being indicted as an alleged foreign agent, we've got other stories that we're covering here.